As you might be well aware, there is a cartoon version of Hegelian dialectics, which gets thrown around, which is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now, could you please, for once, it won't help, but at least those who are listening, so that they, that our listeners can understand what Hegelian dialectics proper is.
Okay. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis is not Hegel.
Yeah.
There are moments, obviously, with thesis and antithesis in Kant's antinomies, but you don't get that in Hegel. So there is a quite technical definition of dialectic, which is in the Encyclopedia Logic, which is that dialectic is the process in which concepts or phenomena turn into their opposites through their own agency.
Yeah.
So, and that is a very fluid and dynamic process. So if we think of tragedy as a good example of dialectic in action, think of Antigone and Creon in Sophocles' play, and without getting into too much detail here, let's take the Hegelian view that both of them are in the right. The dispute concerns whether Antigone's brother can be buried inside or outside the city. And they take different views about this, and both of them take themselves to be in the right, and from Hegel's point of view, both of them are in the right. But in being right, they're both wrong, because they violate the right of the other. And it's the wrong in what they do arises from the way in which they're right. So for Hegel, you can be right in the wrong way. And there's a dialectic to that. That take Hegel's account of freedom in civil society, which anticipates various aspects of Marx. Hegel thinks that when freedom is construed in a certain way, particularly, I suppose, in what we might call a very neoliberal free market way, it produces, through its own dynamic, poverty and alienation. So freedom turns into unfreedom through its own dynamic. And there are various, Hegel's philosophy is shot through with other examples. So dialectic is specifically this process in which something turns into its opposite. So the thesis, antithesis, synthesis is, first of all, it seems to separate out the positive and the negative moment. You have thesis, and then you have the antithesis, and then you bring them together in a separate act. You don't have, with Hegel, two separate acts. You have one category or phenomenon turning itself into its own negative and then reconciling itself with that negative in a higher unity that it generates. So there's no antithesis as something separate from the thesis, and there's no synthesis as a separate act that brings them together. The other thing, just while we're talking about dialectic, that I would urge viewers or listeners to bear in mind, dialectic doesn't happen between A and B. So one sometimes hears people talking about, a dialectic between the individual and society. If you hear anybody ever say there is a dialectic between ... you know that whatever they're talking about, they're not talking about Hegel. Because there is, for Hegel thinks that dialectic is the process of self-undermining, of self-sublation, he calls it, something turning itself into the opposite. Now, that might result in something coming into relation to something else, but the dialectic is not itself between two different things. Or, if there is a dialectic in a relationship, then the dialectic isn't, as it were, between them, but the relationship itself turns into something else through its own dynamic. Now that can happen, certainly. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind, that there's quite a specific sense. And Hegel thinks that a number of popular proverbs encapsulate that idea of dialectic. His favourite one is "Pride comes before the fall." And it's not that you're proudly doing what you do, and then something outside comes in and oops, you fall you fall on a banana skin. But pride is itself the source of its own fall. Now that's a dialectical idea, And it's not difficult to grasp. The mechanism for that dialectic is different in each particular case, which, by the way, is another consequence of Hegel's idea that there can't be some generic dialectical process, because if dialectic is the movement through which A negates itself into B, then the particular way it does it is always dependent on what A is. And A might negate itself in a different way from D or F or M. They all do, they all undergo this process of dialectic in a particular way. So I don't know if that helps, but that's what I would say.
Especially with that example in the end, I think that will help.